In this video, we're going to cover the autonomic nervous system. It's one of my favorite systems. Autonomics gets a really bad rep for being confusing and difficult and sometimes impossible to learn. I think this is because we don't start at the beginning. We start sort of in the middle and expect you to know all this information that you may or may not have. In this series, because of that, we're going to cover the autonomic nervous system, what it does, how it does it in each area, the pathways, the functions. But we're going to start at 0 and we're going to build up. Because I think you're smart and I think you can learn it. And I think anybody can learn anything. But it has to be taught to you in the right way. And in this experiment, we're going to figure out if autonomics is actually hard or if it's just not being taught from the ground up. Let's start with some questions. What is autonomics? Auto means self, and nomics is referring to governance or control that is independent. So literally, autonomics is an independently governed system of self. That was a little bit meta, but it's kind of amazing and really explains the core of the function of autonomics, which is it is controlling itself outside of you. And by you, I mean conscious you. Autonomics is involuntary. You don't get conscious control over the things that it does, like regulating the speed of your heartbeats, how you breathe, like moving food through your guts. A great example of autonomics being subconscious is when a child holds their breath to get what they want. You have to consciously prevent yourself from breathing in this case. You can temporarily override autonomics. It will win in the end. Eventually, you will lose enough oxygen that you pass out and become unconscious. If the autonomic nervous system didn't exist, you would potentially die. But the autonomic nervous system functions regardless of your consciousness. So the autonomic nervous system will kick in when the child passes out because they are no longer overriding it, and you will begin to breathe again while unconscious. So hopefully we can appreciate that this system is pretty important for staying alive. And to get a baseline of our understanding of autonomics, I'm going to give you a quick quiz. Then we're going to dive into the nervous system and build from there. Let's start with what kind of neurons is the autonomic nervous system made up of? And I will give you options. If you said A or C, don't make me come over there and involuntarily slap you. The autonomic nervous system is only made up of motor neurons. Only motor. There is no sensation coming out or being delivered by an autonomic neuron. That's an incredibly important concept. What do autonomic neurons innervate and stimulate? Hopefully, you remembered what I just said about the motor situation, so it couldn't be skin, and skeletal muscle is voluntary, so it's smooth and cardiac muscle that is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And those are the only types of structures that it innervates. How many types of muscle do we have? This one might be an easier one thrown at you, or it might not. We have 3. You have skeletal muscle that is voluntary and not innervated by autonomics, smooth muscle, which lines our organs, vessels, and glands, and cardiac, which is found in the heart. Smooth and cardiac are involuntary muscles and under autonomic control. So based on that quiz, we can define autonomic nerves as motor neurons that stimulate smooth and cardiac muscle to contract automatically without our conscious control. So let's see where autonomics fit into our nervous system as a whole. Our nervous system is divided into 2 main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. And these 2 systems communicate with each other constantly. The central sends out signals to the peripheral, which are efferent signals or fibers, which really just means motor. These signals will go to one of the 3 types of muscle. And we have signals from the peripheral to the central. Those are called afferent, which is another word for sensory. These signals carry sensations from the skin and from the internal organs. To remember efferent means motor, I say make an effort. Usually you have to move to do so. To remember afferent, I say a feeling, to remind myself that it is carrying sensations. That was a very simplified version, so let's add some details to our map without having a nervous breakdown. So we know the central nervous system sends out signals to the peripheral nervous system through efferent nerve fibers, which are motor, and then receives afferent sensory signals from the peripheral nervous system. But more specifically, there are 2 types of efferent motor neurons that are sending signals out. There are somatic and visceral motor signals that have different destinations or targets for innervation. Somatic motor neurons provide innervation to voluntary muscle, therefore skeletal muscle, the ones you can consciously move. If I want to flex my bicep, I can do that by thinking about it. The other type is autonomics, which I called visceral because viscera means organ, and this is going to smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, which is typically found in or on organs. This is involuntary muscle. I can't think about my heart beating and make it beat in any specific way consciously. Autonomics function to keep us alive and therefore must adjust to our specific and current environments. Therefore, we have two distinct types of autonomic nerves for two different scenarios. We have sympathetics and parasympathetics. Sympathetics are for our fight or flight response, and parasympathetics are for our rest and digest response. We will get more into this in a second. Before we do, we must look at the afferent signals because there are also two distinct types. One is signals from internal organs or structures, and we will call that viscera. The second is the sensory portion you are probably well familiar with, which we call our somatic afferents, and this is the very conscious sensations we feel from our skin. This is touch, temperature, pressure, pain, texture. This is what I call our paper cut sensory, whereas visceral sensations are dull and sometimes completely subconscious. I don't know about you, but I don't want to feel every piece of my food that I swallowed go through my entire digestive tract, nor do I want to feel my lungs move against my chest when I breathe. That would be kind of overwhelming. However, there are certain scenarios, typically involving pain, in which I would need to feel my organs, like a heart attack. And that pain from our organs is actually going to be referred to our somatic system so that we can feel it. And we're going to cover this concept in a different video, but I wanted to mention it now. Now that we understand the whole system, we can take a deeper dive into the autonomic system. Let's pull that system out and look at it closer. So we know autonomics is made up of motor neurons that innervate involuntary muscles. It is also known as visceral motor. Visceral just means organ, remember. Organs, glands, and vessels are lined with smooth muscle, and of course our heart is made up of cardiac muscle, and this part of our motor system acts on smooth and cardiac muscle. And we split our autonomic nervous system into two subsystems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetics are designed to help us in high-stress situations, when we must fight or flight our way out of something. Think of all the things your body might do if you saw a tiger stalking you. Parasympathetics are the opposite. They're designed for situations of rest, when we are in low-stress situations and can just digest and rest and worry a lot less about staying alive. Think what your body does when you want to eat a burger and take a nap. Committing this vocabulary to memory will serve you for the rest of your anatomy experience. Somatic is referring to skeletal muscle and skin. Soma means body, so some people call this the body wall. Somatic always refers to your more conscious side of your system. Visceral means organ and refers mainly to your unconscious or subconscious system. Afferent means sensory, and efferent means motor. Now let's solidify the four types of nerves you can have. Somatic afferents are body sensory, therefore conscious sensations from the skin and skeletal muscles. This is like when you get a paper cut and it hurts real bad. Somatic efferents are body motor nerves. They innervate and stimulate voluntary muscles, which are skeletal muscles that are in your conscious control. Visceral afferents are organ sensory nerves. They are mainly subconscious unless something is going very wrong in the body, in which case they will be confused by the brain for somatic afferents. We will cover visceral afferents on their own in a different video so we can better understand referred pain, but visceral sensations are dull and hard to pinpoint in terms of sensation location. Finally, visceral efferents are organ motor, aka autonomics, innervating smooth and cardiac muscle outside of conscious control. Before we can jump into the specifics of parasympathetics and sympathetics, we need to talk about the basic functional unit of the nervous system, which plainly means what all of the structures we're about to talk about, the brain, the spinal cord, ganglia, nerves, are actually made of, and that's different parts of neurons. And for us to understand autonomics, we need to know that there are essentially, in a simplified world, two basic types of peripheral nervous system neurons. There's a typical motor neuron and a typical sensory neuron. And here's your friendly reminder that while I'm showing you a sensory neuron, it's a somatic sensory neuron and has nothing to do with autonomics. So a typical motor neuron looks like this. We call it unipolar. It has a cell body at one pole on one side and then an axon that carries that signal to the next neuron cell body or to its target. A typical sensory neuron looks different. Remember, there are other types of these neurons, but we are focusing on one called pseudo-unipolar, meaning kind of unipolar, but not really. It has a receptor, typically out in the skin and an axon that carries the signal back towards the central nervous system. But the weird part is its cell body is sort of in the middle of the axon, but not quite. It's more to one side. So pseudo-unipolar. Lastly, it's important to note that the pink part of the screen represents the central nervous system and the blue part peripheral. That means the cell body of our typical sensory neuron is in the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system, while the central nervous system is where we find the cell body of our typical motor neuron. Next, I want to clear some terminology because sometimes it's just a vocabulary issue holding you back. For example, a collection of neuron cell bodies is called different things in the two different systems. In the central, a collection of cell bodies is called gray matter or nuclei. In the peripheral, we call that a ganglia. Similarly, axons of neurons are referred to as spinal tracts or white matter in the central nervous system, and when we talk about axons in the peripheral, we're actually talking about our name structures, nerves, dorsal rami, radial nerve, what have you. Keep these definitions at the tip of your mind when we get specific, because it always helps to remind yourself what we're really talking about. Okay, the very last step of our base for autonomics knowledge is we need to know the anatomy of the spinal cord, specifically between the levels of T1 to L2, but we'll explain that part later. If I slice my spinal cord in the middle and look at just one section of the spinal cord, I might see this. Gray matter we know is central nervous system cell bodies, while white matter is axons. Then we're going to get a little more specific and divide our gray matter into sections. The dorsal horn, most posteriorly, contains sensory cell bodies. The ventral horn, most anterior, contains somatic motor cell bodies, and the lateral horn, when it exists, contains autonomic sympathetic cell bodies at specific levels. We will get there. So brain and spinal cord are central nervous system, and then we can see how the peripheral connects to the central at the spinal cord and name the structures that are peripheral. So posterior aspect, we can see coming from the dorsal horn is the dorsal root. On the dorsal root is a bulge, and the bulge is a ganglia. Specifically, it's the dorsal root ganglia that we all know and love. But now understand it's a collection of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, specifically sensory cell bodies. The ventral horn connects to the ventral root, which has no ganglion on it due to the structure of a motor neuron. That is, that they aren't pseudo-unipolar. The dorsal and ventral roots come together to form what we call a spinal nerve, or a mixed spinal nerve, due to the fact that the bundle of neurons contains both sensory and motor neurons, therefore a mixture. This mixed functional spinal nerve then branches in two opposite directions into what we call the dorsal rami and the ventral rami. Rami just means branch. Dorsal rami provide innervation to posterior structures like muscles and skin of the back, whereas ventral rami provide innervation to the anterior structures and are more often given specific names unlike those of their posterior surface. For example, when you learned deep back muscles, you were probably told they were innervated by dorsal rami. That just means posterior spinal branches. That's pretty vague. Whereas on the anterior surface, you were told intercostal nerves innervate the skin of your chest and which spinal levels those intercostal nerves come from. They didn't just say innervated by ventral rami, even though they are. In this picture, we can see why the dorsal root ganglion exists and why the ventral root doesn't have one. Let's follow the path of a somatic sensory neuron from skin with the receptor picking up the signal. Let's say you touched a cold apple and that cold temperature sensation is going to go through the axon in the ventral rami, into the mixed spinal nerve, and through the dorsal root, where its cell body, due to its pseudo-unipolar shape, sits in the DRG. Then the rest of the axon will enter into the dorsal horn to synapse on a central nervous system cell body to deliver that information up to the big boss brain. Not all signals go to the brain. A reflex, for example, would be able to act just through the spinal cord, but we can explore that at a different time. It's too cold and you want to move your hand, so the brain sends down a motor signal that will synapse at the ventral horn, where we find our somatic motor neuron cell bodies. The axon will then travel out through the ventral root into the mixed spinal nerve and into the ventral rami, probably the musculocutaneous nerves, ventral rami, to flex the biceps and lift your hand away from the cold object. So hopefully you can see why I spent time developing terminology and talking about neuron shape. So now we're going to see how this differs in the autonomic nervous system. Our key differences between our somatic motor system and our autonomic motor system is somatic acts on voluntary muscle, whereas autonomic is involuntary. The pathway we talk about in the peripheral nervous system involves one neuron for somatic, but involves two neurons for autonomic. We just saw the somatic motor path. Its cell body's in the ventral horn, then it travels out through the ventral root. An autonomic neuron cell body will depend on what type of autonomics we're talking about and where it is found, and we have two neurons in the pathway, a presynaptic and a postsynaptic neuron. We are going to explore where we find those neuron cell bodies for both sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. All autonomics involve two neurons, a presynaptic, aka preganglionic neuron, and a postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron. This is exactly what you think, the before synapse ganglion neuron and the after synapse ganglion neuron. For those that are unclear, a synapse is the place where the end of the axon, called the axon terminal, dumps its neurotransmitters into the space between itself and the other neuron it's trying to communicate with, to be picked up by the dendrites of the next neuron, and therefore transfer the signal. The postganglionic aftersynapse neuron will then carry that signal and dump its neurotransmitters onto the target, which is smooth or cardiac muscle, and either cause a contraction or inhibit one. The sympathetic and parasympathetic presynaptic neurons and postsynaptic neurons have distinctly different lengths. Sympathetic presynaptic neurons are relatively short compared to their longer relative postsynaptic neurons. Parasympathetics have really super long preganglionic neurons and incredibly short postganglionic neurons, because the postganglionic neurons for parasympathetics are literally in the walls of the organ they are innervating. So the lion's share of the pathway for parasympathetics is preganglionic. Now let's look at that sympathetic pathway even closer. Sympathetic preganglionic cell bodies, so before synapse cell bodies, the first neuron, exist in a very specific location. They are only found in the lateral horn of the spinal cord from levels T1 to L2. Let me show you what I mean. The presynaptic cell bodies of all sympathetic pathways originate from the lateral horn of the spinal cord from levels T1 to L2. That's thoracic first spinal level to lumbar second spinal level. Depending on your curriculum, you may be taught a step further. That is, that there is a specific part of the lateral horn's gray matter, the intermediolateral portion, sometimes called the intermediolateral column, or IML, that specifically is where you find those presynaptic sympathetic cell bodies. We will always shorthand this to IML. Now we know where the cell body is, but what about the axon? The axons of our presynaptic neuron then travel through the ventral root, where all motor signals must go, and into a mixed spinal nerve. The next part of the path is very important, so we're going to go through it visually, then revisit this picture. In order to understand the pathway of presynaptic axons of sympathetic neurons, you first must be familiarized with the sympathetic chain. So we took that person, we removed their arms and legs, and now we are going to take a closer look at our sympathetic chain. It's called a chain or trunk because it is a sympathetic nerve structure comprised of ganglia connected via axons like beads on a string. It's going to span from the neck to the tip of the coccyx bilaterally, so on both sides of the vertebra. These ganglia contain postsynaptic sympathetic cell bodies and are characterized as paravertebral ganglia. Para meaning parallel or on the sides of, due to their location on either side of the vertebra. In a different video focusing on sympathetics, we will hear about the other type of sympathetic ganglia that exists in front of the vertebra instead of on the sides of them and is called prevertebral ganglia. For now, what you need to understand is that 1, this structure exists, 2, all sympathetic pathways involve the sympathetic chain in some regard, and finally, 3, that it functions much like an elevator for sympathetics. There are not quite as many ganglia as there are spinal levels, although it is close. In the neck region, there are only 3 ganglia, a superior, middle, and inferior. In the thoracic region, there are 11 to 12, based on whether or not there is an inferior cervical comboed with a first thoracic, which happens often enough that we have a name for it, called the stellate ganglion. Then there are 4 lumbar and 4 to 5 sacral. If we zoom in on a few spinal levels, we can add in our sympathetic chain to our earlier picture and learn the structures that exist on our sympathetic chain. The sides in this picture don't look equal because I added in an extra level on the right side for example's sake. Remember, it exists from neck to coccyx, so we would see it above and below these thoracic levels. The sympathetic chain is connected to our spinal nerves through 2 very small connections. We can see more medially that the ganglia at level T1 is connected to the spinal nerve via a structure called a gray rami communicans, and then more laterally by a structure called a white rami communicans. I'm going to drop the word communicans and refer to them as gray and white rami. They get their color portion of their names due to the presence or lack of a myelin sheath around the axons that make up these rami. Gray rami have mainly unmyelinated neurons, while white rami have mostly myelinated ones. Most importantly, the white and gray rami connect the sympathetic chain to the spinal nerve. Coming off each sympathetic chain ganglia and heading medially are nerves called splanchnic nerves. Splanchnic means organ, just like visceral means organ, so these nerves go to organs. And lastly, without getting into too many specifics, it's worth noting that white rami only exist at the levels T1 through L2. This is not a coincidence. This is because white rami are the structure sympathetics use to get into the sympathetic chain. Therefore, white rami can only exist where sympathetics originate. Gray rami, however, are how we get out of the chain to specifically get to microstructures in the skin, and therefore can exist on every level of every sympathetic ganglia. Remember, this is an overview. Here's what I want you to take away from this video. Presynaptic cell bodies of sympathetic neurons exist in the IML of the lateral horn of the spinal cord, only from the levels of T1 through L2. All sympathetics are motor and therefore exit the central nervous system through the ventral root, into a mixed spinal nerve, and then get into the sympathetic chain through a white rami communicans. Every sympathetic nerve does this part of the path, regardless of where it began between the levels of T1 and L2. All presynaptic sympathetic axons are going to exit via the ventral root, get into the spinal nerve, and then go through the white rami to enter the chain. The rest of the path after they're in the chain is variable and will be covered in the next video. So returning to our original picture after a very long detour, a postsynaptic cell body will exist in the sympathetic chain ganglia and will be called a paravertebral ganglia, or it will exist in a prevertebral ganglia, which is not a part of the sympathetic chain. The postsynaptic axon will take many different paths depending on where the end destination is. I will reduce this to two possibilities and we will learn the specifics later. Either you are going to the microstructures, the smooth muscle structures in the skin, and you are traveling through a gray rami, or you are going to an organ and traveling via a splanchnic nerve. If sympathetics came from the middle of the spinal cord, parasympathetics come from the ends. I think of parasympathetic origins as my head to butt nerves. Their presynaptic parasympathetic cell bodies are found either in the brainstem nuclei of four cranial nerves, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10, ocular motor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus, respectively, or sacral nuclei in the spinal cord from the levels S2 through S4, which I always remember by saying the phrase S2 through S4 puts the poop on the floor because parasympathetics help you poop. Remember, parasympathetic presynaptics are really, really long, so they travel all the way to the wall of the organ or structure they are innervating, then synapse at the parasympathetic ganglia in that wall that has the postganglionic cell body in it, and then the postganglionic or synaptic cell body's axon is very short and goes to the target, which isn't very far away because we're already in the wall of the organ we want to innervate. But who gives a crap about pathway if we don't know what we're doing? Parasympathetics, I said earlier, help you rest and digest, so I think about all the things my body would need to do if I was going to eat a snack and take a nap. Sympathetics cause very different things to happen in your body as they are doing things to prepare you for fight or helping you flee. So what do they actually do? Sympathetics dilate your pupils to let in more light so you can see all of your surroundings better. They inhibit lacrimation, which is tear production, aka crying, because it's hard to see exits and opportunities when your vision is blurred by tears. We also don't need saliva because you shouldn't be eating and running, but we do want our heart rate up so that we can get more blood to our skeletal muscles and skin. It's why you get flushed when you're nervous. We also want to increase oxygen so we breathe faster. We're going to inhibit digestion and reroute blood away from our digestive tract so that we can focus on the fight at hand. I don't know about you, but when I get nervous, I start sweating, and that's because your sympathetic nervous system stimulates sweat glands in your skin. It also stimulates little muscles in the skin that make your hair stand up. It doesn't always serve you in a fight or running away to pee or poop. It's a method for sure, but not the most effective method for winning a fight, although it could work. Therefore, sympathetics normally prohibit these actions. However, there are certain circumstances when this will happen really quickly so that you can empty and be ready to run. Lastly, sympathetics, weirdly enough, stimulates ejaculation. So ejaculation is actually kind of a stress response. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it, although I can't say for certain, that it might be hard to run away from a tiger if you have an erection. Parasympathetics essentially do the exact opposite of sympathetics. They constrict your pupils and change the shape of your lens in your eyes so you can look at things up close. Think about curling up with a good book while you relax. You need to be able to read the page. You can cry all you want while you rest and digest, eating your ice cream and salivating heavily. Your heart rate will slow and your breathing will too. And instead of rerouting your blood to the skeletal muscles in your skin, you're going to send that blood towards your digestive organs to absorb the nutrients from your food, while you do peristalsis and move that food through your guts. While you rest and digest, you can also defecate and urinate to your heart's desire. And of course, without a tiger in sight, only when your parasympathetics are functioning can you achieve an erection. And that concludes the general functions of the sympathetics and parasympathetics. Let's summarize everything we have learned. Autonomics provides motor innervation to involuntary muscle that is smooth muscle and cardiac muscle found in the walls of organs, glands, and vessels. We have two types of autonomic motor: sympathetics for fight or flight situations, parasympathetics for resting and digesting environments. Sympathetics start in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, specifically in the IML, whereas parasympathetic signals begin in nuclei of specific cranial nerves and sacral nuclei. They both involve pathways with two neurons, a pre- and a postsynaptic neuron, but the locations and lengths of these neurons are different. Sympathetics have shorter before synapse neurons and longer after synapse neurons. Parasympathetics have extremely long presynaptic neurons and very short postsynaptic neurons. This isn't everything we learned today on one slide, but it was hopefully enough for you to have a better foundation of autonomics to build off of as you learn more specifics about each area of the body. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if it helped you learn, and like the video to see more videos like this one in the future. Join us in the next video where we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the sympathetic pathway. Toodles!